Airbus A330 faced dual engine failure as it ran out of fuel in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Farewell, crying and screaming. Both crew and passengers' nightmare was like a Thor hammer lightning. Oxygen masks fell in preparation for the plane crash into the mid-ocean. Anxiety, adrenaline, glider was falling down. All sharks were very hungry. All of these and more are waiting for you. So, let's go.
Hey, dears! Fly, eat, repeat, fabulous folks.
Welcome to the premiere episode of Fly, Eat, Repeat, the show where we defy gravity, dance in the skies, and soar above the clouds. On the evening of August 23, 2001, a total of 306 people, 293 passengers, and 13 crew members boarded an Air Transat Airbus A330, Flight 236, at Toronto's Pearson Airport in Canada. Their destination, Lisbon, Portugal, marking a 7-hour journey across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Most of the passengers were Canadians, excited about their summer vacation in Europe, and Portuguese expatriates going back to visit their families across the ocean. In the cockpit was Captain Robert Piché, aged 48, boasting an impressive flying record of 16,800 hours of flight experience, with 796 of them on the Airbus A330. Alongside him, First Officer Dirk de Jager, aged 28, had about 4,800 hours of flying experience, just 400 of which were on the A330. The plane crew thought it was just a routine flight, and the passengers supposed they could sleep, or have a nice time on the plane until they arrived in Lisbon.
If they had known what would happen to them in the middle of the ocean, none of them would have approached the airport.
Fly, eat, repeat.
Yeah.
Fly, eat, repeat.
Before being hired by Air Transat in 1983, Uncle Piché was arrested for marijuana smuggling from Jamaica into the United States on a small plane like Tom Cruise in American Made, and sentenced to 10 years in prison.
It was a hard time for him.
But he was finally released after 2 years in 1985, thanks to a pardon from the state of Georgia. Despite this will play a main role in our episode, his career with Air Transat had been unblemished until this pivotal moment. Before departure, the aircraft underwent the necessary procedures to obtain ETOPS, Extended Range Twin-Engine Operational Performance Standards, approval, a crucial certification allowing aircraft to operate more than 1 hour away from alternate airports on a single engine. Both the Airbus A330 and Air Transat held the requisite ETOPS approval, ensuring compliance with safety standards for long flights. With 51.6 tons of fuel loaded for the transatlantic journey, 6 tons more than needed for the flight, and all passengers settled on board, Flight 236 started its journey at 9 p.m. local time, equivalent to midnight UTC. The anticipated flight duration was approximately 7 hours, with the captain initiating engine start-up procedures as the aircraft taxied for takeoff. Upon reaching cruising altitude at 39,000 feet, the pilots maneuvered the aircraft eastward,
setting course for Lisbon amid the calm night sky.
When you fly a transatlantic flight and you fly into oceanic airspace, pilots are required to provide position reports at specific intervals due to the absence of radar coverage in those areas. This necessitates the use of HF, high-frequency, radio communication, to relay essential information, such as the aircraft's location and status to the relevant control unit, in this case, Santa Maria Control. Flight 236 adhered to this protocol, making their position report upon passing the longitude 30 west.
During this routine procedure, the flight crew began noticing abnormal readings on the secondary display. Specifically, in the right engine of the plane, the oil pressure was high, the oil quantity was low, and the oil temperature was low.
The crew reported this back via high-frequency radio to their maintenance control center, but they couldn't find any reason for it. At the same time, they received an ECAM message. ECM stands for Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System. It's built to pop up when there are actions needed by the crew. Message alerted the crew to a fuel imbalance. Oh, it's not good because fuel imbalance affects the plane's balance and thus its control. So, the pilots opened the crossfeed valve which allowed fuel to flow from the left wing tank into the right wing tank. However, after 10 minutes, the plane's devices indicated a terrifying emergency, which shocked the pilots like a Thor hammer, after they realized that they didn't have enough fuel to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Dear, to understand the Air Transat 236 incident, we need to start 4 days before the flight. The aircraft involved was an Airbus A330, equipped with a Rolls-Royce RB211 engine. During the routine maintenance procedures, they found metal chips in the oil filter, which means that some kind of failure was about to happen. Despite efforts, they couldn't find where those metal chips were coming from. So, they decided to send the engine in for proper maintenance. But Air Transat lacked a spare engine in North America. So, they had to get a loan engine from Rolls-Royce, which was expedited from Hong Kong. The maintenance crew started the engine replacement. But they faced a setback. The new engine did not align properly within the engine cowl, as it was a different edition, and they couldn't fit all the components correctly. They called Rolls-Royce, and they were advised to exchange all of the engine units. So, they changed the hydraulic pumps and the fuel lines, but they used the old hydraulic line because they didn't have the hydraulic line that was required. They noticed that the hydraulic line and the fuel line came very, very close to each other, but they managed to achieve some clearance in between them. This was checked by the maintenance engineers, and they decided that the clearance between the two lines was enough.
Dear, as an aviation expert, of course, you know that they did not calculate that there was no pressure in the lines, so over time and pressure, it would stiffen out and this clearance would disappear.
Even when the engine did the proper ground run, everything looked fine, so the aircraft was released to service.
Back to the disaster above.
At 4:38 Universal Time Coordinated, the fuel and hydraulic lines within the aircraft began to rub against each other. Resulted in the rupture of the fuel line, creating a huge hole. The aircraft was losing between 12 to 15 tons of fuel per hour, while the typical fuel consumption for an Airbus A330 engine is approximately 2.6 tons per hour. Despite the huge fuel leak occurring in the right engine, there was no indication of the issue, and the engine was working fine. Due to the fuel system of the Airbus A330, which includes 2 wing tanks per wing, a center tank which is used first, and then you have a trim tank back located in the stabilizer. Typically, the trim tank automatically adjusts fuel distribution to maintain the aircraft's center of gravity. However, in this instance, an anomaly occurred. The trim tank initiated its final fuel transfer prematurely, redistributing its entire contents forward into the other tanks. This unexpected action occurred only 4 to 5 hours into the flight, far earlier than the usual half-hour mark before reaching the destination. Dear, as the pilots did not understand that this was an indication of a fuel leak, so, the moment they decided to feed fuel from the left tank into the right tank, they were losing fuel at a double rate, giving a shower to the birds under the plane. Realizing the severity of the situation, the flight crew began exploring alternatives and identified Lodges Airport in the Azores, Terceira Island, as a potential diversion airport. Meanwhile, cabin crew members relayed essential information to the pilots, including wheelchair passengers on board, with instructions to notify Lisbon accordingly.
Fly, eat, repeat.
In 1960, English psychologist Peter Wason coined the phrase confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a human psychological phenomenon, which is the tendency of people to favor information that confirms or strengthens their beliefs or values and is difficult to dislodge once affirmed. In other words, you are not seeking out objective facts, interpreting information to support your existing belief, only remembering details that uphold your belief, ignoring information that challenges your belief.
You act like a lawyer rather than an investigator.
Dear, this is exactly what happened with the crew. They thought that as the fuel consumption for the first 4 hours had been entirely normal, and as there were no explosions or noise, no severe disturbances, and no lightning strikes during the flight, so it's a computer glitch, not a fuel leak.
We are losing a metric ton of fuel every 5 minutes. Hey, Jager, wake up! Uncle Piché, did you smoke your stuff?
Okay. I'll ask the flight attendants to look out over the wings.
But because of the night they could see nothing. This just reinforced their mental model.
See, it's a computer glitch, not a fuel leak.
At 5:59 Universal Time Coordinated, 25 minutes following the initial indication of the fuel imbalance, the fuel is indicating 3 tons in the left wing and 1 ton in the right wing. 14 minutes later, the right engine flamed out. So when that engine flames out, the crew goes through the engine failure checklist and they start their descent down to their single engine service ceiling, a standard protocol for such in-flight events. Now the whole aircraft is carrying just 600 kilograms of fuel across all tanks, and it is 240 kilometers far from the airport. At this critical moment, Jager transmitted a mayday call.
Mayday, 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 Air Transat 236.
Declaring their fuel problems and engine failure. Concurrently, preparations were made within the cabin for a potential off-field landing, including briefing passengers on the possibility of a water landing. Imagine yourself, my dear, sleeping on a 7-hour flight.
You wake up to a nightmare, passengers screaming and shouting, voices explaining to you how you will fall into the ocean.
By 6:26, approximately 13 minutes after the initial engine failure, the aircraft was still far 120 kilometers from Lodge's airport, maintaining flight level 34,000 feet. However, the situation deteriorated further as the remaining left engine also suffered fuel starvation and flamed out. In response to the dual engine failure, the aircraft's ram air turbine, deployed automatically, which is a fan under the fuselage generating limited electrical power essential for critical systems, by spinning in the wind.
Instead of being on one of the most technologically sophisticated aircraft, welcome to a gigantic glider. It's only 15 minutes and the plane would be down, whether it ended up on the runway or in the ocean.
Dear, do you know how hard it is to turn your car's steering wheel when the engine is switched off? That's because your engine provides power for your power steering to work. Now you can imagine Piché's situation with his aircraft.
Scary silence and darkness when both engines flame out. You can't hear anything except the outside air rushing over the wings. And you can't see anything except the emergency exit lights, creating an atmosphere of heightened tension among passengers.
But the cabin crew is doing a great job at this point. They are briefing in English, French, and Portuguese the instructions for emergency life vests and potential evacuation later on. The captain told the flight attendants to prepare the passengers for ditching in the water, which was essentially a death sentence for everyone on board the plane at night. Whoever survives the force of the plane crash will not survive drowning under the waves.
The Atlantic sharks would celebrate 306 happy meals.
When the cabin altitude reached about 14,000 feet, due to the failure of both engines and the pressure difference, the oxygen masks would automatically fall, which would have frightened the passengers even more. Uncle Piché now is squeezing his 16,800 hours of flying and marijuana smuggling experience to get the plane safely to Lodges. At the airport, the tower controller began turning the runway lights on and off to show the pilots where the airport was. The passengers could see it.
A lone point in the dark Atlantic Ocean representing their hope in life.
Now, there are 8 miles left to the airport, but it is still at 13,000 feet, which is very, very high. Usually, about 3,000 feet for 10 miles if both engines are running. So, Uncle Piché asked to do a 360 turn to lose altitude. When you do a 360 turn, during an airplane gliding, you will lose 5,000 feet, and end up at 8,000 feet. So, it's still very high. Therefore, he extended the slats and the landing gear. Now he's doing S-turns to lose altitude and energy as much as possible. Firefighters and ambulances waited on the runway preparing for a fully loaded A330 to crash land. Piché couldn't slow down, otherwise the ram air turbine would stop generating electricity.
The first officer called out airspeeds and altitudes to assist the captain. Piché had one chance to bring the plane down on the runway. The lives of 293 passengers and 13 crew members hung in the balance.
Finally, the plane hit the runway hard. 8 of the 12 tires burst and the plane bounced 350 meters further before slamming back down. The aircraft was high speed, without most of the wing spoilers, and no engine reverse thrust. It wasn't slowing down, the anti-skid system was inoperative. So when the captain slammed on the brakes, the wheels locked up, the massive aircraft was now skidding down the runway, its tires have been worn down. Which eventually led to the plane stopping on the runway. Believe it or not, the plane, with 2 dead engines and no fuel, glided for 120 kilometers and landed safely. Now, as the pilots come to a complete stop, some small fires break out around the blown-up tires which the firefighters immediately put out. Due to this and the ongoing fuel leak, Captain Piché decides to evacuate the aircraft. 306 people managed to escape the plane within 90 seconds. Still, unfortunately, during the evacuation, 14 passengers and 2 cabin crew members sustained mild injuries because some passengers were afraid to jump out onto the slides. Hence, they had to be pushed out by the cabin crew. And a few others were trying to get their hand luggage with them. Here is my advice. If you are in an evacuation situation, follow the cabin crew commands. Go down quickly using regular stairs if available, or jump out and get away from the airplane. The crew were met with a hero's welcome. They had successfully carried out the longest glide of a passenger aircraft in the history of aviation, without any loss of life. The final report declared that the hydraulic line of the spare engine was the cause of the fuel leak, and the crew didn't get properly trained to deal with imbalances caused by fuel leaks. In 2002, ALPA, Airline Pilots Association, awarded Captain Robert Piché and First Officer Dirk de Jager the Superior Airmanship Award in recognition of their extraordinary skill in executing a dead-stick landing of an Airbus A330. To this day, they hold the record for the longest glide of a passenger airliner. When Air Transat admitted their fault, the Canadian government fined them around $250,000. A few months after the incident, when the aircraft had been repaired, it resumed flights with Air Transat, and was nicknamed
Azores glider. As a result of this incident, Airbus introduced a new warning in their flight management computer,
which notifies pilots if there is a high rate of fuel loss. Air Transat also provided its pilots with additional training on fuel management and diversion procedures. These safety improvements mean that Piché and de Jager's record glide is likely to remain a record for a long time to come. On October 18, 2021, Azores glider operated its last flight with Air Transat and was returned to the owner AirCap. In an interview, Piché said, "I was afraid, and I understood that fear could turn into adrenaline and allow humans to go further. But one of the questions that keeps coming back to my mind is, why me?" At least 150 captains could have been assigned the Toronto-Lisbon flight that day. The computer gave me that flight. But why to me? Fly, eat, repeat, fabulous folks. If you want to know why, be aware of confirmation bias, follow crew instructions, and hey, watch the previous episodes, keep an eye out for the upcoming ones, check out the sources below, hit that subscribe button, and always remember this wisdom.
Adrenaline could allow humans to go further.